Thank you very much, Patrick. Our next presenter is Tessie Bailey. Dr. Tessie Bailey is a Principal Technical Assistance Consultant at American Institutes for Research. Her primary responsibilities include developing high-quality technical assistance resources in special education and multi-tiered systems of support response to intervention for states, districts, and institutions of higher education throughout several national centers, including the Collaboration for Effective Educator Development, Accountability, and Reform, and the National Center on Intensive Interventions. In addition, she works with several districts and states to improve specialized instruction and pre-employment transition services for students with disabilities. She is a former special education teacher, professional development provider, and a faculty member with extensive experience in special education law and policy, transition plan and program development, data analysis for program improvement, and MTSS RTI implementation. Dr. Bailey has provided special education and MTSS RTI support and professional development to practitioners and leaders in 43 states. She completed her PhD at the University of Utah in Special Education Curriculum and Assessment, and her postdoctoral work in MTSS RTI and Transition at Lehigh University's Center for Promoting Research to Practice. Welcome, Dr. Bailey.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Dr. Wolf, for sharing that. This is such an important topic, and I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of the implications at the broader level as well. And as you guys know, I mean, charter schools, once they were introduced in 1991 and in Minnesota, and then in 1995 in Louisiana, we've really been struggling with this idea of closing the gap between traditional and charter schools. And I think one of the biggest implications of this and other studies that have come out is that we are really making gains in closing those gaps and ensuring that students with disabilities have equal access to participation at the charter schools. Shortly after the release of this study, the National Center on Special Education and Charter Schools also released a report, and it was Key Trends in Special Education and Charter Schools. And it did a secondary analysis of civil rights data collection to look at something very similar. And I want to share some of that because I think what you see in this study really highlights that this broader national trend that we are able to close those gaps for students. And one of the things you'll notice is that with students with in traditional schools is that trajectory has been pretty consistent, but we've seen a pretty sharp increase in the number of students enrolled in charter schools. What is sort of interesting about this study in comparison to what's happening at the Louisiana and at the national level is that while that gap is decreasing, one of the reasons the gap is decreasing is that the overall enrollment for students in traditional schools has also decreased, which is not consistent with what's happening in Louisiana or in the traditional schools. And in fact, we've seen a decline in the enrollment in traditional schools in those four regions from 11% to 10.7%, while we've actually seen a consistent rate at the national and state level. I think one of the promising outcomes of this data is that we know that the charter schools are actually increasing their enrollment in these regions. I mean, moving from an 8.5% enrollment in 2010, 2011 to 10.2% in 2013, 2014 is pretty remarkable. And that's likely to provide a lot of good examples for how other schools in Louisiana, as well as nationally, can begin to increase that enrollment in the charter school sector. One of the other implications that Dr. Wolf mentioned is really this inconsistency across some of those regions, and that it really is likely your access to charter schools may be dependent upon where your school is located. And I think what was surprising to me is that range of, 5.8% enrollment in some regions versus what we see at the national or at the average level of that 10.2%. And that's something that I think we really need to be paying attention to, because when we look at the average percentage, then we're likely to miss some of those nuances about those districts. The secondary analysis, as I mentioned with the civil rights data, found that the structure of charter schools is sometimes associated with the level of access for students with disabilities. And in fact, charter schools that are their own LEA often enroll a greater proportion of students with disabilities, around 11.5%, compared to charter schools that are part of an LEA. And in those, we tend to see about 9.7%. And I bring this up because if you look at during the time frame of the study, Louisiana had just over 70% of its charter schools that were actually classified as part of an LEA as opposed to an autonomous LEA. And this might provide some explanation about why we see some of those variations in enrollment within and across some of those regions. I think another implication that is important to consider, we've spent a lot of our focus in looking at the gaps over the years. And I know with the reauthorization of IDEA, it actually expanded its focus from access to results-driven accountability. And Dr. Wolf sort of mentioned this, and it was really outside of the scope of this study, but it is something that should be considered in your conversations as you are looking to close some of those gaps and increase enrollment for students with disabilities. And one of the reasons is if we only focus on gaps, we may be incorrectly focusing our technical assistance on moving numbers as opposed to improving quality of services. And I want to point out some of the data that is sort of relevant to the study, is that we look at this idea of more flexible school options like charters actually may be associated with better outcomes for students with disabilities, particularly in Louisiana. When we look at the quality or just the access for students, charter schools often offer more access to general education. They have lower expulsion rates. And this idea that, general or increased access to general education is important because one of the strongest predictors of school completion and post-school success for students with disabilities is access to general education. And something interesting to know is that during this study timeframe, Louisiana actually saw a significant reduction in the number of students with disabilities dropping out of school, a 35% change from 43% in 2008-2009 to just 28% in 2014-2015. And also saw a pretty significant increase in the percentage of students graduating with a regular high school diploma. And we're looking at 27.2% in 2008-2009 to 50.8%. And that might be, not that there's causal data, but something to consider is, is this access to charter schools increasing students' school completion outcomes? Something else that was really interesting and I think has implications for what we do is this, the percentage of students with emotional disturbance who tend to favor charter schools. And we're also seeing that on the national level. And what's interesting about this study is that we also sometimes see or often see students with learning disabilities and autism at a higher rate in charter schools, but this study did not find that. But I think one of the things that we need to consider is that charter schools, as Dr. Wolf mentioned, may really offer students with emotional disturbance increased opportunities for school success. The national data for this group of students indicates that they have the highest dropout of any disability category, and they also have the greatest out-of-school suspension compared to other students. And if we compare that with the previous slide that looks at outcomes for students who are in charter schools, students who are in charter schools have greater access to general ed. then often leads to greater graduation, and they also often have lower expulsion rates as well. And while charter schools can offer a more appropriate environment for students with emotional disturbance, I just want to say that there's no magic bullet. We don't know, every school is different. And if we're really trying to support students with emotional disturbance, we need to make sure that charter schools are equipped to address the unique needs of those students. There are a couple of best practices that I just want to share that are likely to support charter schools as well as traditional schools in increasing outcomes for students with disabilities. As you heard, I do a lot of research in a tiered system of support. And when schools implement a tiered system of support in academics, behavior, social-emotional, it often doesn't just meet the needs of students with disabilities, it increases access to quality instruction for all students. But in order for this to happen, schools really need to ensure that they have the necessary infrastructure. Are their staff qualified? Do they have the appropriate resources and specialists? And I think that latter is why we often see lower rates of students with severe disabilities in charter schools. It's because those resources aren't typically in charter schools. And then finally, it's thinking about how we prepare students. I know Sametta's going to talk about this a little bit, but we often see a lot of students being taught by alternatively certified teachers, and we need to make sure that all teachers are adequately prepared, both general ed and special ed, to support students with disabilities. And we need to make sure that students with the most significant needs for them to be successful in charter school placement is that teachers are using what we often refer to as data-based individualization or high-quality intensive intervention to really support those students with the most intensive needs, regardless of their location of service. There are a couple resources, and we'll be sharing those throughout. They'll also be in the chat box. And feel free to add any questions into the presenter box.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. Our next presenter is Sametta Brown. Mrs. Brown is a retired educator and former CEO of a charter school network in New Orleans. Her tenure as an educational leader includes teacher, supervisor, educational diagnostician, appraisal team supervisor, and executive director of human resource. She is now a partner with B&M Solutions, providing principal/CEO training and support, special education program development, corrective action support, and staff professional development. Mrs. Brown holds a Bachelor of Science degree in speech pathology and a master's degree in special education from Alabama A&M University. She also completed a postgraduate work at Xavier University, earning certification in educational administration and supervision. Welcome, Ms. Brown.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be a part of this webinar today. And as a practitioner, I'm excited to share my views on the study. Thank you so much, Patrick and Tessa, for the great work that you've done in highlighting the gaps and the needs of special education students as well as teachers. As a practitioner here in Louisiana, I found this study to support many of the concerns and issues that we currently face here in Louisiana and that we are beginning to overcome. As you know, our city is at this point by 2020 will be 100% charter. And with that given, we have a different view and a different landscape than most cities. So as a practitioner, my focus is equal access versus equitable access. Versus equitable access. So at this point, no, I'd like to say the challenge of fulfilling the promise of academic achievement in our work has never been greater than it has been today. And that's due to the expectation of teachers as well as students to become contributing citizens and our abilities to prepare those students for that role. So students with disabilities do deserve an education that prepares them to have a fruitful life, that where they can live independently, they can enjoy some of the pleasures that the general education student enjoys. So the findings in this study certainly highlight the work we are doing in Louisiana and support the need to move toward providing that equal access to all students. So as I reviewed the study, some of the key findings do correlate with the state of Louisiana's data, validating that there have been persistent achievement gaps across all disabilities. Now, 4 years later after this study, we find that that gap is changing and closing. However, it is a slow move toward that because, as I stated, we are about to become 100% chartered landscape. And with that comes challenges in regards to alternative certification, preparation of staff and teachers to work with children who have disabilities. So in our grades K through 5, we find that a lot of the gaps can be attributed to the number of charter schools that existed during the study and the fact that there are some schools that have special enrollment criteria which limited students with disabilities from being enrolled in those schools. So we found that before Katrina that uniformly educating our students with disabilities was always a challenge, certainly because of the culture and the landscape of the city. But according to the study, charter schools in New Orleans do readily accept students with disabilities because of the limited number of traditional schools that were available for parents and students to choose from. Traditional schools had stricter enrollment requirements. For instance, we have some high schools and elementary schools that require students to be tested and a determination if they are gifted, which limits some students with disabilities. That's not to say that those schools do not accept students with disabilities. It does say that students with more severe cognitive disabilities have limited opportunities to become a part of those schools. When you look at charter schools in New Orleans particularly have typically accepted students with disabilities, severe, emotionally disturbed, gifted, or what have you, without much consideration of the impact of the school budget. Also, without much consideration of teacher preparation. Because as we have in New Orleans, many of our teachers are alternatively certified, not any less dedicated than a teacher who has gone through the regular teacher track, but also are missing some key pieces in their educational training to help them understand the needs of students with disabilities, help them to understand the resources needed to provide that equal and equitable access. So as I explored the study and I looked at, is the enrollment gap larger for students with disabilities in the earlier grades? Well, to answer that, in the next slide I will, do students' disabilities vary across categories? Is there a tendency of the charter schools to declassify students as requiring an individual education program at a higher rate than traditional schools? So to answer those questions and look deep in those questions, which is supported by the study, is the enrollment gap larger
The enrollment gap is larger for students with disabilities in earlier grades. And again, that is partially attributed to the limited number of traditional schools that have enrollment spaces for children with disabilities. It also focuses on staff preparation and parental understanding of the school programming. And as Tessa stated in her presentation earlier, that parents are seeking better opportunities and access for students, but they may not necessarily understand that charter schools are general public schools. So what you find is a lot of parents are looking at charter schools for their answers because it's new to them. As opposed to traditional schools, many parents seem to believe that a charter school is a private school and it can offer more. The pluses for charter schools are that they do have more autonomy with sending monies down to service students. It's not top heavy when it comes to funding. They're able to better pay their teachers. They're able to provide many resources that traditional schools cannot necessarily budget as easily as charter schools do. Do disabilities vary across categories? And yes, they do. Again, that's attributed to the limited number of traditional schools, families' understanding of school choice programs. Again, many parents feel that charter schools are private schools and that thus we can get a better education. Lack of credentialed staff to provide services to students with disabilities, particular disabilities. For instance, many charter schools are not equipped to enroll students with severe cognitive disabilities. That requires certainly a different level of staff, resources, and support at the school level. Is there a tendency of charter schools to declassify students as requiring an individual education program at a higher rate than charter schools? Well, this is and can be related to the number of traditional schools understanding versus charter schools and their understanding of the service requirements. And again, when you talk about a student with an emotional disturbance, many charter schools certainly do accept them in New Orleans, particularly at a greater rate than the traditional schools. However, again, that can be attributed to the particular enrollment pieces and also to the lower number of traditionally trained teachers. So although there are several comparisons between charter schools and traditional schools in this study, the research gives educators a look at how better to manage provisions of quality education for students with disabilities. In Louisiana, we have developed a funding source to aid schools to better provide an equitable education through a high-cost grant. And this grant, which I use many times in my charter school organization, gives schools extra funding that allows them to choose to use it in a way for disabled students that otherwise they wouldn't be able to access. It provides assistance in developing sensory rooms if needed, extra paras that can be child specific for particular students. For instance, if we need to hire a teacher for one particular student, through those high-cost funders, we can do that because this formula is based on a percentage higher than the cost that is required to educate a general ed child. So with that cost fund does give many schools an opportunity to serve students better. And in the charter schools, with this funding, on top of some of the funding that charter schools do have and the many grants, it provides a more equitable access for students, which gives them a little more equality. So overall, the study did a great job at exploring the gaps, but with its limitations, it did not go into all of the reasons why the gaps. And these gaps are not necessarily reference gaps that we can do a study from. They are gaps that exist because of particular enrollment criteria within the city of New Orleans, particular lack of staff and services at particular schools. But overall, the study presented the uniqueness of serving diverse learners in the state of Louisiana, and it those classifications and gaps across those schools within all the regions, Jefferson Parish and across the state. So in Louisiana, we are continuing to work to build that equitable access for students with disability. And the study's overall findings does support the work that we're doing in Louisiana. I appreciate this opportunity to have spoken with you regarding a practitioner's view of the findings. And please, if you have any questions, do write them in the chat box. Thank you so much.